The bullet missed Lucy Fairmont's head by inches, and she knew in that instant her mother had been right about one thing. Hope was a dangerous luxury in a world designed to break women like them. Fort Benton, Montana, 1882. The town squatted on the banks of the Missouri River like a tired dog. All wooden storefronts and muddy streets that turned to dust when the summer sun bore down hard enough. Lucy had arrived 3 weeks earlier with nothing but a carpet bag, a faded photograph of her mother, and the bitter knowledge that love was exactly what her mother had always said it was. A fairy tale told to young girls to make them foolish enough to trust men who would only disappoint them. The bullet had come from somewhere in the chaos of Front Street, where two ranch hands were settling a dispute over cards in the way men often did out here, with whiskey courage and poor aim. Lucy pressed herself against the wall of the general store, her heart hammering against her ribs, and waited for the shooting to stop. She had learned to make herself small, to disappear into the background. It was a skill her mother had taught her before the consumption took her last winter, leaving Lucy alone at 22 with no family and no prospects. "Miss, you hurt?" The voice came from above her, deep and concerned, and when Lucy looked up, she found herself staring into the bluest eyes she had ever seen. They belonged to a man who had positioned himself between her and the street, his broad shoulders blocking her from any stray fire. He wore a dusty brown hat, a worn leather vest over a chambray shirt, an expression of genuine worry that seemed so out of place Lucy almost laughed. "I'm fine," she said, hearing the sharp edge in her own voice. "You can move." But he didn't move, not until the sheriff had dragged both fighters off to the jail and the street had returned to its usual state of controlled chaos. Only then did he step back and offer her his hand. Lucy ignored it, pushing herself up from where she had crouched against the wall. "Name's Frank Dalton," he said, not seeming offended by her refusal. "I work the Double Bar Ranch about 5 miles north of town." "I didn't ask," Lucy replied, brushing dust from her gray skirt. She had 3 dresses to her name, and she couldn't afford to ruin any of them. She worked as a seamstress in the back room of Mrs. Henderson's dress shop, and the wages barely covered her room at the boarding house and 1 meal a day. Frank Dalton studied her for a moment, and Lucy felt the weight of his gaze like a physical thing. He was younger than she had first thought, maybe 25 or 26, with sandy hair that curled slightly at his collar and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from granite. There was a kindness in his face that made Lucy instantly suspicious. In her experience, kind men were usually the most dangerous ones. "Well, miss, I didn't ask," he said with a slight smile. "I'm glad you're not hurt, but you might want to consider staying inside when the shooting starts. Fort Benton's not always this exciting, but we have our moments." "I'll keep that in mind," Lucy said coolly, and walked away without looking back. She felt his eyes on her all the way down the boardwalk, and something in her chest twisted uncomfortably. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "Men will say anything, Lucy girl. They'll promise you the moon and the stars, but when morning comes, you'll find yourself alone with nothing but broken promises and a broken heart. Love is what they tell you, to keep you compliant, to make you believe there's something more than just survival. Don't be foolish enough to believe them." Elizabeth Fairmont had been beautiful once, or so Lucy remembered from her earliest childhood. But years of following Lucy's father from town to town, watching him drink away every dollar they earned, had carved the beauty from her face and replaced it with hard lines and harder truths. When he finally left them in St. Louis without so much as a goodbye, her mother hadn't even cried. She had simply looked at 10-year-old Lucy and said, "Remember this. Remember what trust gets you." Lucy had remembered. She had watched her mother work herself to exhaustion, taking in laundry and mending clothes, never smiling, never hoping for anything better. And when the sickness came, her mother had faced it with the same grim resignation she had faced everything else. "Don't waste your life waiting for some man to save you," she had whispered on her deathbed, her hand gripping Lucy's with surprising strength. "There's no such thing as true love, Lucy. It's just a story we tell ourselves to make the disappointment hurt less." Lucy had promised. She had buried her mother in a pauper's grave and used the last of her savings to buy a train ticket west, to Montana Territory, where she heard there was work for women willing to labor. She hadn't come looking for love or adventure. She had come looking for survival, plain and simple. But Frank Dalton seemed to have other ideas. He appeared at Mrs. Henderson's shop the next morning, his hat in his hands, asking if she did repairs on leather goods. Mrs. Henderson, a shrewd woman in her 50s who saw opportunity in everything, practically pushed Lucy forward. "Miss Fairmont is excellent with leather work," she said, though Lucy had never touched a leather vest in her life. "Show her what you need, Mr. Dalton." Frank pulled a worn saddlebag from under his arm, and Lucy could see immediately that the stitching had come loose along one side. It was simple enough work, but the way he was looking at her made it clear the saddlebag was just an excuse. "I can fix it," Lucy said flatly. "Come back tomorrow." "Much obliged," Frank said, his blue eyes crinkling at the corners when he smiled. "Say, I was wondering if you might—" "Tomorrow," Lucy repeated, and turned back to the dress she had been hemming. She heard Mrs. Henderson walk him to the door, heard their lowered voices, though she couldn't make out the words. When her employer returned, the older woman was shaking her head. "That's Frank Dalton," Mrs. Henderson said. "Good man. Lost his parents to fever 5 years back, and he's been running their ranch ever since. Not many young men out here would turn down the chance to sell off and move to easier territory. But he stayed. Honors his parents' memory." "That's very admirable," Lucy said, without looking up from her stitching. "Is there a point?" "The point, Miss Fairmont, is that you could do a lot worse than a man like that showing interest. You're young and pretty, but pretty fades fast out here, a woman alone." "I'm fine alone," Lucy interrupted. "I don't need rescuing." Mrs. Henderson sighed. "Nobody said anything about rescuing, but surviving isn't the same as living, girl. You might want to remember that." Lucy didn't answer. She finished the hem with neat, precise stitches, the way her mother had taught her. Every stitch perfect, every measurement exact. There was comfort in the predictability of needle and thread, in knowing that if you followed the pattern, you would get the expected result. People were not like that. People were chaos and disappointment waiting to happen. Frank came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Each time he had some small item that needed mending: a torn shirt, a split seam in his work gloves, a button missing from his Sunday coat. Mrs. Henderson took his money with barely concealed amusement, and Lucy fixed each item with mechanical efficiency. "You're very good at this," Frank said one afternoon, watching her work on a complicated repair to his leather chaps. They were alone in the shop. Mrs. Henderson had gone to have tea with the banker's wife. "It's not complicated," Lucy replied. "You follow the pattern." "I think it's more than that," Frank said quietly. "I think it takes patience and care. I think it takes seeing what needs to be fixed and knowing exactly how to fix it." Lucy's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "You're reading too much into simple sewing, Mr. Dalton." "Frank," he corrected, "and maybe I am, or maybe I'm just trying to understand you." "Why?" The word came out sharper than she intended. She set down the chaps and looked at him directly for the first time since he had walked in. "Why do you keep coming here? Why do you care about understanding me?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, turning his hat in his hands. Outside, a freight wagon rumbled past, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked. Finally, he said, "Because the first time I saw you, pressed against that wall with gunfire in the street, you didn't scream or cry or faint like some women might have. You just made yourself smaller and waited it out. And when I offered to help you, you looked at me like I was something dangerous, like kindness was a trap." "Maybe it is," Lucy said. "Maybe you've been hurt enough to believe that," Frank replied. "But I'd like the chance to prove you wrong." Lucy felt her mother's voice rise up inside her, sharp and warning. This was how it started, with pretty words and earnest eyes. This was how men made you believe, made you hope, made you vulnerable enough to destroy. "I don't need proving wrong," she said, picking up the chaps again. "I need paying customers who actually need their items repaired, not men who tear perfectly good clothing just for an excuse to talk to me." Frank had the grace to look embarrassed. "The chaps really were torn. The stitching came loose," Lucy said, examining the leather. "But the rest of this damage is fresh. You did this yourself, probably this morning." "Maybe I did," Frank admitted. "Maybe I couldn't think of another way to see you, since you won't let me buy you dinner, or take you to the church social, or even just walk with you down by the river." He stood up, settling his hat back on his head. "I'm not a man who gives up easy, Lucy Fairmont. My parents taught me that anything worth having is worth working for." "I'm not something to be won," Lucy said coldly. "No," Frank agreed. "You're someone to be earned. There's a difference." He left before she could respond, and Lucy found herself staring at the door, long after it had closed behind him. Her hands were shaking slightly as she returned to the chaps, and she had to redo 3 stitches because her concentration had been broken. That night, alone in her small room at the boarding house, Lucy took out her mother's photograph. Elizabeth Fairmont stared back at her from the faded image, unsmiling, her eyes already holding the disappointment that would define her later years. The photograph had been taken in better times, when Lucy's father was still around, when her mother still believed his promises about the future they would build together. "I won't be like you," Lucy whispered to the image. "I won't let myself hope for things that don't exist." But even as she said it, she thought about Frank Dalton's blue eyes and the earnestness in his voice. She thought about the way he had put himself between her and danger without a second thought, and the way he kept coming back even when she gave him nothing but cold responses. The next week brought a surprise. Lucy was working on a particularly difficult dress order when Mrs. Henderson called her to the front of the shop. Waiting there was not Frank, but a young boy of about 12, holding a basket covered with a red checkered cloth. "Delivery for Miss Fairmont," the boy announced, "from Mr. Dalton at the Double Bar Ranch." Lucy took the basket warily, and the boy scampered off before she could question him. Under the cloth, she found a still warm loaf of bread, a jar of honey, 6 fresh eggs, and a note written in careful, blocky handwriting. "Thought you might enjoy some things from the ranch. The hens are laying well, and the bread is from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who is the best baker in Montana Territory, Frank." "Well now, Mrs. Henderson said, peering into the basket. "That's quite thoughtful." Lucy wanted to refuse it, wanted to march out to the Double Bar Ranch and tell Frank Dalton to stop whatever game he was playing. But the truth was, she had been surviving on bread and weak tea for the past 2 weeks, saving every penny to replace her worn-out shoes. The sight of those eggs and that golden honey made her mouth water. "It doesn't mean anything," she said, more to herself than to Mrs. Henderson. "Of course not," Mrs. Henderson agreed, but there was a knowing look in her eyes that made Lucy uncomfortable. The deliveries continued. Every few days the same boy would appear with something from the ranch: fresh vegetables, a jar of preserves, once even a thick wool blanket as summer began to fade toward fall. The notes were always simple, never demanding anything in return, just Frank sharing what he had. Lucy told herself she only accepted them because refusing would be wasteful. She told herself it meant nothing. But she found herself watching for the boy's arrival, and once she caught herself smiling at one of Frank's notes that described his best horse having an argument with a stubborn fence post and losing. "You're fighting it awful hard," Mrs. Henderson observed one afternoon in early September. "Whatever it is you're so afraid of." "I'm not afraid," Lucy said automatically. "Then what do you call it?" The older woman sat down beside her, setting aside the ledger she had been working on. "That young man has done nothing but show you kindness for months now, and you treat him like he's cursed. What did some man do to you to make you so certain they're all poison?" "Not to me," Lucy said quietly. "To my mother. My father made her promises and broke everyone. She spent her whole life loving a man who didn't deserve it, waiting for him to become what he claimed he'd be, and in the end, he just left, walked away like we meant nothing." "I'm sorry for that," Mrs. Henderson said, and she sounded like she meant it. "That's a hard thing to grow up seeing, but Frank Dalton isn't your father." "All men say they're different," Lucy replied, "until they're not." "Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment, then said, "My Harold wasn't perfect. He drank too much sometimes, and he had a terrible temper when things went wrong. But he loved me true for 32 years, right up until the day his heart gave out. He kept his promises, even when they were hard to keep. Even when I made them hard to keep." She reached over and patted Lucy's hand. "Not every man is a liar, child. Some of them really are exactly what they appear to be." Lucy wanted to believe her. That was the terrifying part. She wanted to believe that Frank Dalton was genuine, that his kindness was real, that maybe her mother had been wrong about love being nothing but a fairy tale. But wanting to believe and actually believing were 2 different things, separated by a canyon of fear that Lucy didn't know how to cross. The first snow came early that year, dusting Fort Benton with white in the middle of October. Lucy was walking back to the boarding house after work, her thin shawl pulled tight against the cold wind, when she heard hoofbeats behind her. She turned to find Frank Dalton dismounting from a large roan horse, leading the animal toward her. "Evening, Miss Lucy," he said, touching the brim of his hat. He had taken to calling her Miss Lucy instead of Miss Fairmont, and she had stopped correcting him sometime in August, though she couldn't say exactly when. "Mr. Dalton," she acknowledged, continuing to walk. The wind cut through her shawl like it wasn't even there, and she shivered involuntarily. Frank fell into step beside her, leading his horse. "Getting cold early this year. Old-timers say it means a hard winter." "I'll manage," Lucy said, though she had no idea how. Her room at the boarding house had a small stove, but coal was expensive, and Mrs. Henderson had already mentioned that work would slow down once the worst weather hit. People didn't much care about new dresses when they were just trying to stay warm. "I'm sure you will," Frank said. "You strike me as someone who knows how to survive just about anything." He paused, then added, "But there's a difference between surviving and thriving. You deserve to thrive, Lucy." She stopped walking and turned to face him. The setting sun cast long shadows across Front Street, and Frank's face was half in light, half in shadow. "Why?" she demanded. "Why do you care so much about what I deserve? You don't even know me." "I know you're scared," Frank said simply. "I know someone hurt you, or hurt someone you loved, badly enough that you've built walls so high nobody can see over them. I know you're alone in a hard town with winter coming, and you won't accept help because you think accepting help means owing someone, something you can't afford to give." He took a step closer, his blue eyes intense. "And I know that for some reason I can't quite explain, the first moment I saw you, I knew I wanted to spend the rest of my life proving to you that not all men are whatever man made you stop believing in goodness." Lucy's breath caught in her throat. The wind whipped around them, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was standing, near enough that she could see the gold flecks in his blue eyes and the earnest set of his jaw. "My mother told me love was a fairy tale," she whispered. "She said men make promises they never intend to keep, that hoping for more than survival is just setting yourself up for heartbreak." "Your mother was wrong," Frank said gently. Or maybe she was just hurt so badly she couldn't see past her own pain. "But Lucy, not everyone is like whoever hurt her. Some of us mean what we say. Some of us make promises and keep them, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard." "How can I believe that?" Lucy asked, and she heard the break in her own voice, felt the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "How can I trust that you're different?" "Let me show you," Frank said. "Not with words. Words are easy. Let me show you with actions, with time, with every day that I prove I'm exactly who I say I am." He reached out slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and gently took her hand. His palm was warm and calloused from ranch work, and his fingers were careful around hers. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I'm just asking you to let me try to earn it." Lucy looked down at their joined hands, at the way his thumb was moving in a small, comforting circle against her skin. Everything in her wanted to pull away, to retreat behind her walls, where it was safe and predictable and lonely. But there was a smaller voice, growing stronger, that whispered, "What if? What if Frank was different? What if her mother had been wrong? What if there was more to life than just surviving?" "I don't know how," she admitted quietly. "I don't know how to let someone in." "Then let me teach you," Frank said. "One day at a time, no expectations, no demands. Just let me be here, and maybe eventually you'll believe that I'm not going anywhere." Lucy wanted to say no. She wanted to protect herself the way her mother had taught her. But standing there in the cold October wind with Frank Dalton's hand warm around hers, she found herself nodding instead. "One day at a time," she echoed. Frank's smile was like sunrise, bright and full of promise. "That's all I'm asking." He walked her the rest of the way to the boarding house, leading his horse with one hand while keeping the other firmly wrapped around Lucy's. He didn't try to come inside, didn't ask for anything more than what she had given. He simply tipped his hat, mounted his horse, and rode off into the gathering darkness, leaving Lucy standing on the porch with her heart pounding and her mother's warnings echoing in her ears. That night, sleep wouldn't come. Lucy lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the warmth of Frank's hand and the earnestness in his eyes. She thought about her mother, bitter and broken, and wondered if perhaps her mother's experience had been specific rather than universal. Maybe not all men were like Lucy's father. Maybe Frank Dalton really was exactly what he appeared to be, a good man who wanted to care for her. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. The next morning, Frank was waiting outside Mrs. Henderson's shop when Lucy arrived for work. He held out a steaming cup of coffee from the restaurant down the street, and when Lucy took it, their fingers brushed. The coffee was sweet with sugar, a luxury she rarely allowed herself. "Thank you," she said, and saw his face light up at the words. "Can I walk you home after work?" Frank asked. Lucy hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Yes, you can." And so began a pattern that would define the next 2 months. Every morning, Frank was waiting with coffee. Every evening, he walked her home, always leading his horse, always staying exactly as long as Lucy was comfortable and not a moment longer. Sometimes they talked about inconsequential things, the weather, town gossip, the novels Lucy had read, and the ranch work that occupied Frank's days. Other times they walked in comfortable silence, simply existing together in the same space. Slowly, so slowly Lucy barely noticed it happening, the walls around her heart began to crack. Frank never pushed, never demanded more than she was willing to give. When she flinched away from sudden movements, he made his own movements slower and more predictable. When she deflected personal questions, he answered them about himself instead, offering pieces of his own life without requiring reciprocation. He told her about his parents, killed by typhoid fever 5 years earlier, within days of each other, leaving Frank alone at 20, with a struggling ranch and a mountain of debt. He told her about the first winter after they died, when he had seriously considered selling everything and going back east to find easier work. But he had stuck it out, honoring his parents' memory by keeping their dream alive. "They loved each other something fierce," Frank said one November evening as they walked through light snow. 40 years they were married, and I never once heard my father raise his voice to my mother, or saw my mother treat him with anything but respect and affection. They worked together, built that ranch together, weathered every storm together. That's what love should be, I think. Partnership. Choosing each other every day, not just when it's easy. Lucy thought about her parents, about her father's broken promises and her mother's bitter resignation. "Not everyone gets that lucky," she said softly. "No," Frank agreed. "Not everyone does, but some people do, Lucy. Some people find it, and I think maybe, if you're willing to risk it, we could find it too." Lucy stopped walking, her heart hammering in her chest. The snow was falling heavier now, coating Frank's hat and shoulders with white. "You're talking about forever," she said. "You barely know me." "I know enough," Frank said simply. "I know you're strong and smart and scared. I know you work hard and expect nothing from anyone. I know you've been hurt and you're trying your best not to get hurt again. And I know that every day I spend with you, I'm more certain that I want to spend all my days with you." "That's insane," Lucy whispered, but there was no heat in it. "Maybe," Frank said, smiling slightly. "But that doesn't make it less true. I'm not asking you to marry me tomorrow, Lucy. I'm just telling you what's in my heart so you know where we're heading if you decide to keep walking this path with me." Lucy looked up at him, at this earnest cowboy who had spent months proving himself through small acts of kindness and unwavering patience. Her mother's voice was still there, warning her, telling her she was being foolish. But there was another voice now, too, her own voice, asking questions her mother had never allowed. What if I deserve to be happy? What if love isn't a fairy tale? What if Frank Dalton really is the kind of man who keeps his promises? "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I know," Frank said gently. He reached out and cupped her cheek with one gloved hand, his touch so careful it made her eyes sting with unshed tears. "But maybe we can be afraid together. Maybe being afraid doesn't mean we shouldn't try." Lucy closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, feeling something inside her chest crack open just a little bit more. "One day at a time," she said again, and felt him smile against her forehead as he pressed a feather-light kiss there. "One day at a time," he agreed. Winter deepened, and with it, Lucy's feelings for Frank. She started accepting his invitations to Sunday dinners at the ranch, where she met his neighbors and saw the life he had built. The double-bar ranch was modest but well-maintained, with a sturdy house that Frank's father had constructed with his own hands, and a barn that housed 6 horses and a dozen head of cattle. Mrs. Patterson, the neighbor who made the bread, became something of a surrogate grandmother to Lucy, teaching her about ranch life and telling stories about Frank's childhood that made him blush and made Lucy laugh. There was Mr. Chen, who ran a small farm on the adjoining property and traded vegetables for help with heavy labor. There was the elderly Whitmore couple, who treated Frank like the son they had never had. This was Frank's community, and slowly, they became Lucy's too. On Christmas Eve, Frank took Lucy to the church social, despite her protests that she had nothing appropriate to wear. Mrs. Henderson had helped her alter one of her dresses with some lace and ribbon, and when Frank saw her, he looked at her like she was wearing silk and diamonds. "You're beautiful," he said simply, and Lucy believed him. The social was held in the church hall, decorated with pine boughs and paper snowflakes cut by the children. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, and for the first time since her mother's death, Lucy felt like she belonged somewhere. Frank danced with her, his hand firm at her waist, guiding her through steps she barely knew. He introduced her to everyone as "my Lucy," and she found she didn't mind the possessive at all. "Having fun?" Frank asked as they swirled through a waltz, his blue eyes warm in the lamplight. "I am," Lucy admitted, and realized it was true. She was having fun. She was happy. The revelation was both wonderful and terrifying. As midnight approached and the new year drew near, Frank led her outside into the cold December night. The sky was clear and full of stars, and their breath formed clouds in the freezing air. "Lucy Fairmont," Frank said, taking both her hands in his. "I know you're still scared. I know you're still fighting against everything you were taught about men and love and trust. But I need you to know that I love you. I've loved you since that day on Front Street when you looked at my offer of help, like it was a poisoned apple. I've loved you through every cold response and every wall you've built, and I'll love you every day for the rest of my life if you'll let me." Lucy's breath caught. "Frank, I'm not asking you to say it back," Frank interrupted gently. "Not until you're ready, not until you believe it. I'm just telling you the truth of my heart, and I'm promising you that I will spend every single day proving to you that your mother was wrong. Love isn't a fairy tale, Lucy. It's real, and it's standing right here in front of you, asking you to believe in it." Tears streamed down Lucy's face, freezing on her cheeks in the cold. Every instinct she had screamed at her to protect herself, to pull away before the inevitable disappointment came. But as she looked into Frank Dalton's eyes, so blue and so earnest and so full of love, she realized something fundamental had changed inside her. The walls were still there, but they had cracked wide enough for hope to seep through. "I don't know if I believe in fairy tales," she said, her voice shaking, "but I think I might be starting to believe in you." Frank's smile was radiant. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and Lucy let herself be held. She pressed her face against his chest and listened to the steady beating of his heart, strong and sure and reliable. "That's enough," Frank murmured into her hair. "That's more than enough." They stood there in the snow until the church bells rang in the new year of 1883, and Lucy thought that maybe, just maybe, her mother hadn't been entirely right after all. The winter was harsh, just as the old-timers had predicted. Temperatures dropped so low that the Missouri River froze solid, and snow piled up in drifts that reached the second-story windows of some buildings. Work at Mrs. Henderson's shop slowed to a trickle, and Lucy's savings dwindled despite her careful rationing. Frank noticed, of course. He always noticed. One evening in late January, he arrived at her boarding house with a load of split firewood and wouldn't leave until he had stacked it beside her stove. "Frank, I can't accept this," Lucy protested, even as she eyed the wood hungrily. Her room had been bitterly cold for the past week. "You can and you will," Frank said firmly. "And before you argue that you don't want to owe me anything, let me be clear, you don't. This isn't a transaction, Lucy. This is me taking care of someone I love, because I couldn't live with myself if I knew you were freezing when I have resources to spare." "But—" "No buts," Frank said, brushing wood chips from his sleeves. "Besides, you mended my work coat for free last week when the pocket tore. We can call it even if it makes you feel better." "That was 15 minutes of work," Lucy argued. "This is a cord of wood." "Then I guess I value your 15 minutes very highly," Frank said with a grin that made Lucy's heart skip. He crossed the small room and took her hands, which were red and chilled despite the gloves she wore indoors. "Lucy, I know accepting help is hard for you. I know you're used to doing everything yourself. But part of caring for each other means letting someone else carry some of the weight sometimes. Let me do this, please." Lucy looked down at their joined hands, at the way Frank's thumbs were rubbing warmth back into her frozen fingers. She thought about her mother, who had worked herself to death rather than accept help from anyone, who who had been so determined to prove she needed nothing from any man that she had refused even legitimate kindness. Was that strength, or was it just another kind of prison? "Thank you," Lucy said quietly, "for the wood, for everything." Frank pulled her into his arms, and Lucy went willingly, resting her head against his shoulder. She could feel the warmth of him, even through their layers of winter clothing, could smell the clean scent of snow and pine that clung to him. "I'm getting better at this," she murmured against his coat, "at letting you in." "I know," Frank said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "and I'm so damn proud of you for trying." February brought a blizzard that shut down the town for 3 days. Lucy was stranded at the boarding house, watching the snow pile higher and higher outside her window when she heard a commotion downstairs. Moments later, there was a knock on her door, and when she opened it, Frank stood there covered head to toe in snow, his face red from the cold, but his eyes bright with concern. "You rode through this?" Lucy demanded, pulling him inside. "Are you insane? You could have died out there." "I had to make sure you were all right," Frank said, his teeth chattering. "The storm came up so sudden, and I knew you might not have enough supplies to last it out." Lucy wanted to be angry with him for risking his life, but instead she found herself overwhelmed with emotion. He had ridden through a blizzard just to check on her. He had put himself in danger because he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone and possibly in need. "You could have died," she repeated, but her voice was softer now, thick with tears. "But I didn't," Frank said, reaching out to cup her face. His fingers were like ice against her skin. "I'm right here, and so are you, and everything's all right." Lucy threw her arms around him, not caring that he was soaking wet and freezing cold. "You terrify me," she whispered fiercely. "The way you make me feel, the way you make me hope for things I swore I'd never hope for. You terrify me, Frank Dalton." "Is that so bad?" Frank asked, his arms tightening around her. Lucy pulled back just enough to look up at him. His blue eyes were questioning, hopeful, patient. Always so patient with her and her fears and her walls. In that moment, looking at this good man, who had spent months proving himself through action rather than words, Lucy felt the last of her walls finally, completely crumble. "I love you," she said, and felt the truth of the words resonate through her whole body. "I love you, and it scares me to death. But I can't keep pretending I don't. I can't keep fighting it." Frank's face transformed with joy so pure it took Lucy's breath away. He kissed her then, really kissed her for the first time, and Lucy kissed him back with all the pent-up emotion she had been holding inside for months. His lips were cold but soft, and he tasted like snow and promise and home. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Frank rested his forehead against hers. "Say it again," he whispered. "I love you," Lucy said, and this time it came easier. "I love you, Frank Dalton." "I love you too, Lucy Fairmont," Frank replied, "and I'm going to marry you if you'll have me." Lucy laughed, the sound bright and surprised. "Is that a proposal?" "It's a statement of intent," Frank said with a grin. "The actual proposal will be much more romantic, I promise. But I wanted you to know where my mind is at, now that we've established the whole loving each other thing." Lucy shook her head, still smiling. "You're ridiculous." "Ridiculously in love with you," Frank agreed and kissed her again. He stayed until the storm broke, propriety be damned, sleeping in the chair by her stove while Lucy took the bed. They talked through the long hours of the blizzard, sharing stories and dreams and fears. Lucy told him about her childhood, about watching her mother's spirit break a little more each day. Frank told her about the loneliness of running the ranch alone, about nights when he wondered if he would spend his whole life without a partner to share it with. "And then I saw you," Frank said, "pressing yourself against that wall, so small and fierce and determined to survive whatever came your way. And I thought, that's her. That's the woman I've been waiting for." "I wasn't exactly welcoming," Lucy pointed out. "No, you were terrifying," Frank agreed with a laugh. "But I'm a patient man, and you were worth waiting for." When the storm finally cleared and Frank rode back to his ranch, Lucy stood at her window and watched him go with a fullness in her chest she had never experienced before. This was what her mother had called a fairy tale, this feeling of being seen and valued and loved. But it wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was real, built on months of steady effort and unwavering commitment. Frank had proven himself not with grand gestures, but with daily acts of care and respect. Her mother had been wrong. Love wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, it transformed Fort Benton almost overnight. The snow melted, the river thawed, and the town came back to life with a vengeance. Work at Mrs. Henderson's shop picked up, and Lucy found herself busier than ever with orders for new dresses and spring clothes. Frank came by every day without fail, always with some excuse. He needed buttons sewn on a shirt, or he wanted to pick up an order Mrs. Henderson had mentioned, or he was just passing by and thought he'd stop in. Lucy saw through every excuse and loved him all the more for making them. "You're glowing," Mrs. Henderson observed one April morning after Frank had left. "Love suits you, Miss Fairmont." "Does it show that much?" Lucy asked, unable to keep the smile off her face. "My dear, you're practically radiating," Mrs. Henderson said with a chuckle. "And I'm happy for you. That young man is the genuine article, and you deserve a bit of happiness after everything you've been through." Lucy thought about her mother, about the bitterness that had consumed her final years. She wished Elizabeth Fairmont could have known Frank, could have seen that not all men were like Lucy's father, and maybe it would have given her some peace in her final days to know that her daughter would find something better. On the 1st of May, Frank took Lucy on a picnic to a spot along the Missouri River where the wildflowers were blooming in impossible profusion. The air was warm and sweet with the smell of spring, and the water rushed past in a torrent of snowmelt, loud and alive. They ate the lunch Mrs. Patterson had packed for them: fried chicken, fresh bread, early strawberries, and sugar cookies. They talked and laughed, and Frank picked wildflowers to weave into Lucy's dark hair. She felt younger than she had in years, lighter, like some heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. After they had eaten, Frank stood up and offered Lucy his hand. She took it, letting him pull her to her feet, and he led her to a flat rock overlooking the river. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and orange. "Lucy Fairmont," Frank said, and when she turned to face him, she found him down on one knee. Her breath caught in her throat. "The day I met you, I thought you were the most stubborn, guarded, frustrating woman I'd ever encountered, and I was absolutely right." He grinned up at her. "But I also thought you were brave and strong, and worth every ounce of patience I could muster, and I was right about that too." He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it, revealing a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the sunset light. "I don't have much," Frank continued. "Just a ranch that barely turns a profit and a house that needs more work than I can keep up with. But I have a heart that's completely yours, and I promise you that every day for the rest of our lives, I will prove to you that love isn't a fairy tale. It's real, and it's work, and it's choosing each other even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Tears streamed down Lucy's face as she looked at this man, this impossibly good man who had spent nearly a year proving himself through action rather than words. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Frank Dalton, I will marry you." Frank slipped the ring onto her finger, and Lucy threw her arms around him, nearly knocking them both into the river in her enthusiasm. They laughed and cried together, and when Frank kissed her, Lucy tasted salt and joy and the promise of a future she had never let herself imagine before. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered against his lips. "Believe it," Frank said firmly. "This is as real as it gets, Lucy. This is us building a life together, one day at a time." They were married in June in the small church in Fort Benton, with Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson standing up with them and half the town in attendance. Lucy wore a dress she had sewn herself, simple white cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs, and Frank wore his Sunday suit with a new tie that Lucy had helped him pick out. When the minister asked Frank if he took Lucy to be his lawfully wedded wife, Frank's "I do" was firm and sure, his blue eyes never leaving her face. And when it was Lucy's turn, she thought of her mother one last time, of all the warnings and bitter wisdom Elizabeth Fairmont had tried to impart. Then she pushed those thoughts aside and answered from her heart. "I do," she said clearly, and meant it with every fiber of her being. The kiss Frank gave her when they were pronounced husband and wife was sweet and full of promise, and the cheer that went up from the congregation made Lucy laugh against his lips. This was real. This was happening. She was married to Frank Dalton, and she was happy, and her mother had been wrong about everything that mattered. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors bringing food and drink and well wishes. They danced in the yard as the sun set, with a fiddle player providing music and the stars beginning to emerge overhead. Frank held Lucy close, swaying her gently to the music, and she rested her head on his shoulder and thought about how far she had come from that frightened girl pressing herself against a wall on Front Street. "Happy?" Frank murmured into her hair. "Terrified," Lucy admitted. "But yes, happy. Good terrified or bad terrified?" Lucy pulled back to look at him, at this man who was now her husband, her partner, her future. "Good terrified," she said. "The kind of terrified that means something important is happening. The kind that means I'm alive." Frank smiled and spun her in a slow circle. "I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret taking a chance on me," he promised. "I know you will," Lucy said. "That's why I said yes." They stayed up late into the night, dancing and laughing with their friends and neighbors. And when everyone finally went home and Frank carried Lucy over the threshold of their house, she felt something settle deep in her chest. This was home. Not the building, but the man. Frank Dalton was her home, and she was his. And together they would build something that lasted. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The ranch demanded constant work, and money was always tight. There were days when Lucy wondered if they would make it through the winter, times when unexpected expenses threatened to overwhelm them. But Frank never wavered, and Lucy discovered that she was stronger than she had realized. The skills her mother had taught her, meant for survival alone, became tools for building a life. She sewed and mended not just for money, but to keep their household running. She learned to cook and preserve food, to tend the garden Mrs. Patterson helped her plant, to work alongside Frank when he needed an extra pair of hands. And through it all, Frank kept his promise. Every single day, he proved that love was real. He proved it by getting up before dawn to care for the animals so Lucy could sleep a bit longer. He proved it by splitting extra firewood and stacking it neat beside the stove. He proved it by listening when she talked about her fears and doubts, never dismissing them, always taking them seriously. He proved it in 1,000 small ways that added up to a life Lucy had never imagined she could have. In the spring of 1884, Lucy discovered she was pregnant. She was terrified in a way that had nothing to do with the physical dangers of childbirth. Though those were real enough in Montana territory, she was terrified because she had no idea how to be a mother to a child when her own mother had been so consumed by bitterness. What if she passed on that same cynicism? What if she couldn't protect her child from disappointment and heartbreak? Frank found her crying in the barn one evening, and he sat down beside her in the hay and pulled her close. "Tell me," he said simply. "I don't know how to do this," Lucy sobbed. "I don't know how to be a mother. My mother loved me, but she was so angry at the world, so certain everything would go wrong. What if I'm like that? What if I can't give our child what they need?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, just holding her and letting her cry. Finally, he said, "You know what you're not going to do? You're not going to tell our child that love is a fairy tale. You're not going to teach them that hope is foolish or that trusting people is dangerous. Because you know now that none of that is true." He pulled back to look at her, his blue eyes serious. "You're going to love our child the way we love each other, Lucy, fully and honestly and without reservation. And yes, you'll probably make mistakes because every parent does, but you'll be there and you'll try, and that's what matters." "What if I mess it up?" Lucy whispered. "Then we'll fix it together," Frank said firmly. "That's what marriage is, Lucy. That's what partnership means. We face things together, and when one of us is weak, the other is strong." Lucy leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. He had been proving himself to her for 2 years now, day after day, never failing, never wavering. Maybe it was time she started believing in herself the way Frank believed in her. "We're having a baby," she said, testing the words out loud. "We're having a baby," Frank agreed, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "And they're going to be so loved, Lucy, so incredibly loved." Their son was born in December of 1884, during a snowstorm that rivaled the one that had brought Frank to Lucy's door 2 years earlier. Mrs. Patterson served as midwife, with Frank pacing anxiously outside the bedroom until the baby's first cry rang through the house. When Mrs. Patterson finally let him in, Lucy was exhausted but beaming, holding a red-faced, squalling bundle wrapped in a quilt. "Meet your son," Lucy said, and watched Frank's face transform with wonder as he looked at their child for the first time. They named him Thomas, after Frank's father, and he had Lucy's dark hair and Frank's blue eyes. Frank cried when he held his son for the first time, big tears rolling down his cheeks while he marveled at the tiny fingers and perfect little nose. "He's so small," Frank whispered, terrified of dropping him. "He'll grow," Lucy assured him, watching her husband fall in love with their child. "They always do." Motherhood was harder than anything Lucy had ever done, but it was also more rewarding. Thomas was a colicky baby who seemed to cry more than he slept, and there were nights when Lucy walked the floor with him for hours, exhausted and frustrated, and wondering if she was doing everything wrong. But Frank was always there, taking his turn with the baby, supporting Lucy when she felt like she was failing, reminding her that they were in this together. And as Thomas grew, Lucy discovered that she was not her mother. She was capable of joy in a way Elizabeth Fairmont had never been. She could look at her son and her husband and feel grateful for what she had, rather than bitter about what she had lost. The cynicism her mother had tried to instill in her had been worn away by 2 years of Frank's steady love, replaced with something Lucy had never expected to feel: hope. By the time Thomas was walking and talking, Lucy was pregnant again. Their daughter Grace was born in the summer of 1887, an easier baby than her brother had been. She had Frank's sunny disposition and Lucy's determined nature, and Frank spoiled her absolutely rotten. "You're creating a monster," Lucy told him one afternoon, watching Frank let 3-year-old Grace help him mend a fence, which really meant she was handing him the wrong tools and chattering constantly. "She's perfect," Frank insisted, hoisting Grace onto his shoulders. "Aren't you, sweetheart?" "Perfect," Grace agreed cheerfully, pulling on Frank's hair. Lucy shook her head, smiling. This was her life now, a house full of noise and love, a husband who still looked at her like she hung the moon, children who were growing up knowing they were wanted and cherished. It was so far from what she had expected, from what her mother had taught her to expect, that sometimes it still took her breath away. The ranch grew more prosperous as the years passed. Frank's hard work and shrewd decisions paid off, and by 1890, the Double Bar Ranch was one of the more successful operations in the area. They were able to hire help, which gave Frank more time to spend with his family. They expanded the house, adding on rooms for the children and a proper parlor where Lucy could entertain the friends she had made in the community. Mrs. Henderson retired and sold her shop to Lucy, who ran it successfully, while also managing the household and raising the children. It was exhausting work, but Lucy thrived on it. She had discovered that she liked building things, liked seeing the results of her efforts. The shop prospered under her management, and she took on 2 young women as apprentices, teaching them the sewing skills her mother had taught her, but without the bitterness that had accompanied those lessons. Thomas grew into a serious boy who loved the ranch, and spent every free moment following his father around, learning everything Frank could teach him about horses and cattle and the land. Grace was more social, making friends easily and charming everyone she met. They were good children, well-loved and happy, and Lucy sometimes looked at them and couldn't believe they were hers. "You're thinking too much again," Frank said one evening in the summer of 1892. The children were asleep upstairs, and they were sitting on the porch watching the sun set over the prairie. Frank had his arm around Lucy's shoulders, and she was tucked against his side, comfortable and content. "Just thinking about how different my life turned out from what I expected," Lucy said. "Better different or worse different?" Frank asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "So much better," Lucy said honestly. She turned to look at him, at this man who had spent 10 years now, proving every day that love was real. There were threads of silver in his sandy hair now, and lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, but he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "You kept your promise, you know. You really did prove me wrong." "About what?" Frank asked, though she could see he knew what she meant. "About everything," Lucy said. "About love being a fairy tale, about men making promises they can't keep, about hope being foolish. You proved all of it wrong, Frank Dalton, every single day for 10 years. Frank pulled her closer and kissed her temple. "I had good motivation," he said. "You're worth every bit of effort, Lucy. You always were." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Lucy thought about her mother, about Elizabeth Fairmont's bitter warnings and dire predictions. She wished her mother could have lived to see this, to know that her daughter had found something real and lasting. Maybe it would have given her some peace to know that not every story ended in disappointment. "I wish my mother could have met you," Lucy said quietly. I wish she could have seen that she was wrong. Maybe she would have been happy for you, Frank suggested. Maybe under all that bitterness, she wanted better for you than she had for herself. Maybe, Lucy agreed. She hoped it was true. She hoped that somewhere, somehow, Elizabeth Fairmont knew that her daughter had found the kind of love she had stopped believing in, and that she was glad. In 1893, Lucy discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise at 33 when she had thought they were done having children. The pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, and there were moments when Lucy was frightened by how tired she felt, how much her body protested. But Frank was there every step of the way, taking on more of her responsibilities, making sure she rested, worrying over her with an intensity that was both touching and slightly annoying. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Lucy told him when he insisted on carrying her up the stairs one evening. "Humor me," Frank said, not putting her down. "You're carrying precious cargo." Their second son, James, was born in April of 1894, another blue-eyed, dark-haired baby who looked like the perfect combination of both his parents. Thomas, now 9, was delighted to have a brother. Grace, at nearly 7, was less impressed by the squalling infant, but warmed up to him when he started smiling at her. Lucy was 34 now, Frank was 37, and they had 3 healthy children, a prosperous ranch, and a life they had built together through hard work and dedication. On their 12th anniversary, Frank took Lucy back to the spot along the river where he had proposed, and they sat on the same flat rock and watched the water rush past. "Do you remember what I said when I asked you to marry me?" Frank asked, holding Lucy's hand. "You said love isn't a fairy tale. It's real, and it's work, and it's choosing each other even when it's hard," Lucy recited. She had never forgotten those words. "And," Frank prompted. "And you were right," Lucy said, smiling at him. "It is work. Some days are harder than others. But I choose you, Frank Dalton. Every day I choose you." "I choose you too," Frank said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing her knuckles. "Every day for the rest of my life, I choose you." They kissed there by the river, surrounded by wildflowers just like they had been 12 years earlier, and Lucy felt the same surge of joy and gratitude and love that she had felt on their wedding day. Her mother had been wrong about so much, but the one thing she had been most wrong about was this. Love wasn't a fairy tale that left you disappointed when reality intruded. Love was reality. Love was the everyday choosing, the small kindnesses, the commitment to keep showing up even when it was difficult. Love was Frank Dalton, spending 12 years proving through actions rather than words that he meant every promise he had ever made. Life continued to unfold in the way life does, with joy and sorrow, triumph and setback. Thomas grew into a capable young man who took over more of the ranch work as Frank's back started bothering him in his early 40s. Grace became a beautiful young woman who had her mother's skill with a needle and her father's head for business. James was the surprise, the late baby who grew up adored by his older siblings and his parents. In 1905, when Lucy was 45 and Frank was 48, Thomas married a girl from town and brought her to live at the ranch. Lucy helped her daughter-in-law settle in, teaching her the rhythms of ranch life, and found herself thinking often of Mrs. Patterson, who had done the same for her years earlier. The circle of life, the passing down of knowledge and love from one generation to the next. Grace married a banker's son in 1908 and moved to Helena, where she opened her own dress shop. Lucy was proud of her daughter's independence and ambition, though she missed her terribly. But Grace visited often, bringing her husband and eventually her own children, and the house was once again filled with the laughter of grandchildren. James decided he wanted to study law and went east to school, breaking tradition but making his parents fiercely proud. Frank and Lucy sold some of their land to pay for his education, considering it an investment in their son's future. When James returned with his degree, he set up practice in Fort Benton and became one of the most respected lawyers in Montana. Through it all, Frank and Lucy remained each other's constant. They aged together, their hair graying, their bodies slowing down, but their love for each other never diminishing. Frank still brought Lucy coffee in the morning, though his hands shook a bit now. Lucy still mended his clothes, though her eyesight wasn't what it used to be. They still sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, grateful for another day together. In 1915, on their 33rd anniversary, Frank took Lucy back to their spot by the river one more time. They were both slower now, Frank using a cane and Lucy leaning on his arm. But they made the journey together, sitting on their rock and watching the water flow past just as it had for decades. 33 years, Frank said, marveling. Some days it feels like yesterday that I first saw you, pressed against that wall on Front Street. Other days it feels like I've loved you forever. Both things can be true, Lucy said, leaning her head on his shoulder. They fit together perfectly after all these years, like two pieces of a puzzle that had been made for each other. Do you ever regret it? Frank asked. Saying yes to me, taking a chance on an optimistic cowboy who was probably too stubborn for his own good? Lucy lifted her head to look at him, at this man who had spent more than 3 decades proving himself to her every single day. His face was lined now, his hair more silver than sandy, but his blue eyes were the same as they had been that first day, kind, patient, full of love. Not for one single moment, Lucy said firmly. Not 1 second of one day in 33 years have I regretted choosing you, Frank Dalton. You kept every promise you ever made to me. You proved my mother wrong about everything that mattered, and you gave me a life more beautiful than I ever dreamed possible. Frank's eyes were wet with tears. You gave me the same thing, he said. A life worth living, a family to love, a reason to be the best man I could be. They kissed there by the river, an old married couple still as in love as they had been on their wedding day, maybe even more so because their love had been tested and proven true over decades. And Lucy thought about her mother one last time, about Elizabeth Fairmont who had died believing love was a lie told to fool young girls. I wish you could see this, Mama, Lucy whispered to the memory. I wish you could know that you were wrong and that being wrong meant I got to be happy. I wish you could have let yourself believe in something good. But Elizabeth Fairmont was long gone, and Lucy was here, alive and loved and surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived. Her children were grown and happy, her grandchildren were healthy and thriving, and she had spent 33 years with a man who loved her exactly the way love should be, steadfast, patient, real. Frank pulled her close, and they sat together as the sun set one more time over the prairie they had called home for more than 3 decades. The river flowed past, constant and eternal, and Lucy felt at peace in a way her mother never had. She had taken a chance on hope, on love, on a cowboy with blue eyes and steady hands who had promised to prove her wrong about everything she believed. And he had. Every single day Frank Dalton had proved that love wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. Years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of a life well lived. Frank's health began to fail in his late 60s, his body worn down by decades of hard ranch work. Lucy cared for him with the same devotion he had shown her throughout their marriage, helping him dress, making sure he took his medicine, sitting with him when the pain was bad and holding his hand through the difficult nights. I'm sorry, Frank said one evening, when he was 72, lying in their bed with Lucy sitting beside him. I'm sorry I'm not the strong man I used to be. I'm sorry you have to take care of me like this. Frank Dalton, Lucy said firmly, squeezing his hand, you spent 40 years taking care of me. You proved every single day that you were worthy of trust and love. You gave me 3 beautiful children and a life beyond my wildest dreams. The least I can do is sit with you now and hold your hand. This is what partnership means. This is what in sickness and in health means. I'm not going anywhere. Frank smiled at her, his blue eyes still as bright as they had been that first day on Front Street. I love you, Lucy Dalton. Every day for 42 years, I've loved you. I love you too, Lucy said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. Every day for 42 years, and every day for however many we have left. Frank lived another 3 years, long enough to see Thomas's eldest son take over as primary manager of the ranch. Long enough to attend Grace's youngest daughter's wedding, long enough to shake James's hand when his son won his first major case. He died peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1920, with Lucy lying beside him, her hand in his. Lucy was 71 when she buried her husband, and though the grief was crushing, she also felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had been given more than 4 decades with Frank Dalton, more than 4 decades of being loved and cherished and proven wrong about every cynical belief she had ever held. She had been blessed beyond measure, and though she would miss him every day for the rest of her life, she would never regret taking that chance all those years ago. She lived another 15 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She ran the dress shop until she was 80, finally retiring when her hands became too stiff with arthritis to hold a needle steadily. She spent her final years in the house Frank had built, the house where they had raised their family, and she was content. On her deathbed in 1935, at the age of 86, Lucy was surrounded by 3 generations of family. Thomas held one hand, Grace held the other, and James sat at the foot of her bed. Her grandchildren and great-grandchildren filled the room, all of them wanting to say goodbye to the matriarch who had loved them so fiercely. "Tell us the story again, Grandma," one of her great-granddaughters asked. "Tell us about how you met Grandpa Frank." Lucy smiled, her mind drifting back to that day on Front Street in Fort Benton, Montana, more than 50 years earlier. "My mother told me love was a fairy tale," she said, her voice soft but clear. "She told me men make promises they never keep, that hoping for more than survival was foolish, and I believed her because I had no reason not to." "But then what happened?" the great-granddaughter prompted, though she had heard this story 100 times. "Then I met your grandfather Frank," Lucy continued, "and he spent every single day for the rest of his life proving me wrong. He proved that love wasn't a fairy tale at all. He proved it was real and solid and worth fighting for. He proved that some people really do keep their promises, that some love really does last forever." She looked around at the faces of her family, at the legacy she and Frank had built together through 4 decades of partnership and love. "And the moral of the story," Lucy said, "is that sometimes being wrong is the best thing that can ever happen to you. My mother was wrong, and because she was wrong, I got to spend 45 years with the best man I ever knew. I got all of you. I got a life more beautiful than I ever imagined possible." "We love you, Mama," Thomas said, tears streaming down his weathered face. "I love you too," Lucy said. "All of you. And when you think of me, when you remember me, remember this. Love is real. It's not always easy, and it requires work and patience and commitment, but it's real. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let fear or bitterness or past disappointment stop you from believing in something good." Lucy closed her eyes, tired but peaceful. She could almost feel Frank beside her, his hand warm in hers, his voice whispering that he loved her. She had lived a good life, a full life, a life that had exceeded every expectation. Her mother had been wrong about love being a fairy tale, but in a way, that made Lucy's life with Frank even more magical, because it had been real. Every moment of it had been real. Lucy Fairmont Dalton died that evening, surrounded by love, and her last thought was of a young cowboy with blue eyes and steady hands who had promised to prove her wrong about everything she believed. He had kept that promise every single day for the rest of his life, and in doing so, he had given her the greatest gift imaginable, the knowledge that love, real and true and lasting, actually existed. Her mother had told her love was a fairy tale. The cowboy had spent every day proving her wrong, and Lucy had spent 45 years learning that sometimes the best stories are the true ones, the ones built on daily choices and steady commitment, the ones that last a lifetime and beyond. She had been wrong to believe her mother's bitter wisdom, but that was all right. Being wrong had given her everything that mattered. In the end, love wasn't a fairy tale at all. It was simply Frank Dalton keeping his promises day after day, year after year, until those daily choices had built a lifetime of happiness that echoed through generations. And that was better than any fairy tale could ever be.